My brother-in-law looked me dead in the eye at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago and told me I needed to loosen up about money. He said it with a smile, the kind that lands somewhere between charming and condescending, and everyone at the table laughed a little, and I laughed too, because that's what you do. I think about that moment a lot now. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I spent 11 years as a forensic accountant for a regional insurance firm in Ohio. I audit claims. I trace money. I find the places where numbers stop adding up, and I follow the thread until I know exactly where it leads. It's not glamorous work. My wife used to joke that I was the only person she knew who relaxed by reading bank statements. She wasn't wrong. My wife passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone faster than either of us was ready for. She had a sister. I'll call her my sister-in-law. And after my wife died, her family stayed close. Her parents were older, struggling with the loss in their own way, and I made a point to stay connected. It felt like the right thing. It felt like what my wife would have wanted. Her brother. I'll call him my brother-in-law because that's what he was, technically, even after everything. Moved back to Columbus about 18 months after my wife passed. He'd been living in Atlanta, doing something vague and real estate consulting, which I'd learned over the years meant whatever he needed it to mean in any given conversation. He was 41. Charming. Good with people in the way that some men are good with people. Not because they care, but because they've studied how caring looks. He moved back, and within 3 months, he was having dinner with my in-laws twice a week. Within 6 months, he was managing their finances. That detail took me longer to find out than it should have. My father-in-law is 78. My mother-in-law is 74. They're not naive people, but they're from a generation that trusts family with money, because that's what family is for. When their son offered to take some of the stress off by handling their bills, their investments, their monthly transfers, they were grateful. They told me about it casually, the way you mentioned that someone fixed the leaky faucet. It wasn't a conversation. It was an update. I smiled and said that sounded helpful. Inside, something shifted. Not alarm, not yet. Just a small, quiet awareness, the kind I've learned to listen to after a decade of finding things people tried to hide. I didn't say anything. I wasn't in a position to say anything. He was their son. I was the husband of their daughter who was no longer alive. There's a version of that dynamic where I have standing to question things, and there's a version where I absolutely do not. I knew which version other people would see, so I watched instead. The first thing I noticed was small. My mother-in-law mentioned in passing that she'd had to wait a bit for her property tax reimbursement from the trust account she and my father-in-law maintained. The trust had been set up years ago, originally managed by their attorney, then transferred to a financial advisor, and now, apparently, handed to their son to simplify. She said it breezily. I asked one question: how long did she wait? She thought about it. 6 weeks, she said, maybe a little more. Property tax reimbursements from a well-managed trust account do not take 6 weeks. I let it go. I made a note of it in my head and I let it go. A month later, my father-in-law mentioned he was thinking about selling a parcel of land he owned outside of Zanesville, about 40 acres he'd held for 30 years, assessed at roughly $280,000. He said his son had found a buyer. The deal was moving quickly. He seemed pleased. He also seemed slightly confused about the terms, which I attributed at first to age, and then, when he repeated the number, to something else entirely. The buyer was offering $190,000, cash. Closing in 3 weeks, I asked as gently as I could whether he'd had an independent appraiser look at the property recently. He said his son had taken care of all of that. I asked if he'd seen the appraisal document. He said he thought so. Yes, somewhere in the folder his son kept for him. I said that sounded great and changed the subject. That night I pulled comparable land sales in Muskingum County for the past 18 months. 40-acre agricultural parcels within 15 miles of that property were selling between $20,000 and $310,000. the $190,000 and $310,000. The $190,000 offer wasn't just low. It was structured to look like the best deal available to someone who didn't know how to look. I still didn't confront anyone. Evidence is stronger than suspicion. I learned it the hard way, years ago, on a claim case where I moved too fast and the subject had just enough time to reorganize the paper trail before I could document it. I lost that case. I never made that mistake again. I needed access to documents I didn't have and wasn't entitled to. That was the problem. My in-laws' financial records weren't mine to request, and their son was the one holding them. If I went directly to my father-in-law and said, "I think your son is stealing from you," I would be the person causing damage. I'd be the paranoid, grieving, overstepping ex-in-law with a grudge, even if I was right. So I took the only approach that would actually work. I called my father-in-law's attorney. I'd met her twice, once when my wife and I updated our own wills, and once at a family event years earlier. I explained who I was. I explained my professional background. I told her I had concerns about the management of my in-laws' trust, and that I had observed two specific anomalies that, in my professional opinion, warranted a review. I did not accuse anyone. I did not name anyone. I asked whether she had seen recent account statements. She had not. She had been, to use her word, transitioned out of the day-to-day management when the brother-in-law took over. She'd received one letter thanking her for her service to the family. She was quiet for a moment after I said my piece. Then she said, "Let me make some calls." What happened next took about 3 weeks, and it moved faster than I expected once it started moving. The attorney requested a full accounting of the trust under her fiduciary authority. She was still technically listed as co-trustee, a detail the brother-in-law had apparently missed or miscalculated. He pushed back. He said the family was handling it internally. She sent a formal letter with a deadline. He produced documents. The documents were incomplete. She retained a forensic accounting firm, not mine, to avoid any conflict, and they began the actual audit. I want to be honest about what those 3 weeks felt like. There was a version of me that wanted to be wrong. Not because I liked my brother-in-law exactly, but because being right meant my in-laws were going to go through something painful at an age when they deserved peace. My father-in-law had buried his daughter. My mother-in-law called me every Sunday morning, still the way she always had, and we talked about the weather and her garden and whatever was on the news. I sat through those conversations knowing what might be coming and feeling the weight of it. I didn't sleep much those 3 weeks. The audit came back with findings that were worse than what I'd suspected, and I had suspected quite a bit. Over 14 months, the brother-in-law had transferred a total of $214,000 out of my in-laws' trust. Not all at once, nothing that would trigger an immediate bank alert. It came out in increments, $4,200 here, $11,500 there. A property management fee for the Zanesville land of $8,000, paid to an LLC he had registered in Nevada 8 months earlier. Consulting fees, paid to himself under a different name, for services he had documented in invoices he had also created himself. The land sale to the cash buyer, a buyer who turned out to be another LLC, also connected to him, would have netted him an additional spread of nearly $60,000 at closing. That deal had not yet closed. My mother-in-law had been waiting 6 weeks for her property tax reimbursement because the account it was supposed to come from had been depleted. When the attorney presented the findings to my in-laws, I was not in the room. I had asked not to be. This was not my moment to be present for. What happened between them and their son was theirs to navigate, and my being there would have made it about something other than what it needed to be about. I was told later by the attorney that my father-in-law didn't speak for a long time after she finished, that my mother-in-law asked her to repeat the total amount 3 times. The brother-in-law was confronted separately. He had explanations for everything, which is standard. In my experience, people who steal from family almost always have explanations ready, because they've been rehearsing them in case this day came. He said the transfers were loans with an implied understanding of repayment. He said the LLC arrangement was for tax efficiency. He said the land deal was being done below market to ensure a fast close and protect his parents from a prolonged process. None of it held up. The Columbus Police Financial Crimes Unit opened an investigation in the third week of October. He was charged with elder financial abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, and wire fraud, the last one because some of the transfers crossed into transactions he'd processed while physically in Kentucky on a trip, which made them federal. I'll be honest, the federal piece surprised me. I hadn't anticipated that wrinkle. His attorney was good. The case took 8 months to work through, continuances and motions, and the particular slowness of the legal system when the defendant has resources. He pled guilty to 2 of 3 charges in a negotiated agreement, sentenced to 30 months, ordered to make full restitution, $214,000 plus interest, and permanently barred from serving as trustee or financial manager for any individual or estate in the state of Ohio. The land deal never closed. My father-in-law still owns those 40 acres outside of Zanesville. I'm going to tell you the part that doesn't have a clean ending, because I think you deserve the honest version of this story. My mother-in-law still struggles with it, not with the money. They'll recover financially, or close enough given time. She struggles with the fact that she handed the folder to her son. She trusted him with the thing her late husband had spent 40 years building, and he treated it like a resource to extract from. She told me, about 2 months after the sentencing, that she keeps thinking she should have seen something. I told her that the people who steal from the ones who love them are counting on exactly that. That love makes people trust in ways that caution wouldn't allow. She said, "You saw it." I told her that was different. I told her that I see these things the same way a doctor sees symptoms. Not because I'm smarter, but because I've spent years learning to look at numbers without feeling about them first. It's not a virtue. It's a professional habit. And I told her something else, something I meant. I almost didn't say anything. I almost convinced myself it wasn't my place. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I'm glad you did. My father-in-law and I still go to Ohio State games together in the fall. We sit in the same section we sat in when my wife was alive, and we talk about football, and we don't talk about his son, and sometimes on the drive home, he says something about her. My wife, his daughter. And I just listen, because that's what the moment calls for. There's a saying I've had on a notepad in my office for about 6 years. A colleague wrote it down for me after a particularly bad fraud case early in my career. The trail always exists. You just have to be patient enough to follow it. My brother-in-law spent 14 months believing he'd covered his. He was wrong. He was wrong because he underestimated patience and because he forgot, or maybe never bothered to learn, that the man his sister had married spent his career finding exactly this kind of trail. He forgot who was sitting at that Thanksgiving table. I haven't forgotten that dinner. I think about it sometimes, that smile, that comment about loosening up about money. I think about the fact that even then the transfers had already started. He was already doing it while passing the gravy and making everyone laugh. I'm not a vengeful person. I don't think this story is about revenge exactly. It's about what happens when someone mistakes your quietness for ignorance, when they look at a man who doesn't say much and assume he doesn't see much either. I see everything. I just wait until I can prove it. I've been doing this work long enough to know that people who take from the people who love them rarely think of themselves as thieves. Sterling didn't. I could see it in how he carried himself at that sentencing, slightly indignant, like a man who'd been misunderstood rather than caught. He had explanations ready for every line item. He probably still believes, somewhere in the back of his mind, that things just got complicated and the wrong people overreacted. That's the thing about a certain kind of person. The lie isn't just what they tell others. It's what they've told themselves so many times it calcified into something that feels like truth. What I've come to understand, after years of following paper trails that people thought they buried, is that our choices don't disappear. They accumulate. Every transfer Sterling made, every false invoice he generated, Every week he let my mother-in-law wait for money that was already gone. Those weren't isolated decisions, they were a pattern, and patterns always become visible to someone who knows how to look. He just didn't think that someone would be sitting across from him at his own family's dinner table. I think about Harlan a lot. He's a quiet man. Always has been. The kind of father who showed up to every school event and never said much, but was always there. He spent 40 years building something so that his wife wouldn't have to worry, so that when they were old, the small anxieties of life would be softer. What Sterling took wasn't just money. It was the specific peace of mind that 40 years of careful living is supposed to earn you. That's not a number on a restitution order. That's something that doesn't fully come back. And Eleanor, she's the one I worry about most even now. She's a strong woman, sharper than people give her credit for. But she handed her son a folder and said, "Here, I trust you." And that trust was the instrument he used against her. She keeps thinking she should have known better. I keep telling her that trusting your child isn't a failure of intelligence. It's the natural consequence of having loved someone for 40 years. You can't call that a mistake. You can only call it human. What I want people to take from this, if anything, is not that you should become suspicious of everyone around you. That's no way to live. What I'd say instead is this: pay attention to the small things that don't add up, even when you don't want to, especially when you don't want to. The discomfort of asking the hard question is always smaller than the cost of not asking it. I almost stayed quiet because I told myself it wasn't my place. That one moment of hesitation, if I'd given into it, would have cost 2 elderly people another year of losses they couldn't afford. Patience and evidence. That's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not some dramatic confrontation, just the quiet, unglamorous work of following a trail until it tells you something undeniable. Sterling counted on everyone around him being too polite, too loyal, too emotionally invested to look clearly. He was right about almost everyone. He was wrong about me. I'm not saying that to be proud of myself. I'm saying it because I think there's something worth holding on to in that idea. That clarity, when it's disciplined and patient, is one of the most powerful things a person can bring to any situation. Not anger, not accusation, just the steady, practiced willingness to see what's actually there. Harlan still owns those 40 acres outside of Zanesville. He mentioned last fall that he's thinking about leaving them to his grandchildren. I told him that sounded right. He nodded and didn't say anything else, and we watched the rest of the game, and that was enough.